Keep coming in. This is going to be fun. Lot of space up here on the front row. This is not like Shauna's the first lady of the church and no one can sit around her, okay? She gets bored, especially when she's heard it for a second time. So feel free to join her up here. And today we bring this When Life Crashes series to a close. And it's been really incredible and encouraging to see what God has done in the life of our church throughout this series. And just as we've talked about how God is able to heal us during those times, we've talked about how it's possible to realize that God is good even when everything around us isn't. And what I want to do today, let me tell you the three things we're going to try to accomplish with the rest of our time this morning. First of all, I want to just give us kind of a summary of some of the questions we've asked and some of the statements that we've made. Secondly, we want to figure out how does Joseph's life end as far as at least what the Bible tells us, so we're going to do that. And thirdly, what I'm really excited about is you getting the opportunity to hear from a great young couple in our church who's gone through all of the kinds of things we've been talking about, and they've come out on the other side, and they're going to open up their hearts and their lives and share that with us, okay? Everybody clear? Summary? I know those of you that love to know where we're going. Some of you are like, man, I remember going to church when I was a kid. The bulletin laid out everything. I knew what songs were coming and which stanzas we were going to sing. For those of you that grew up in church, you know what I'm talking about, like first, second, not the third, fourth, and when the offering was coming and what the pastor was preaching on. So if that's you and you need that, sorry, we don't have that here. But I've just told you where we're headed. We're going to summarize this thing. We're going to close out Joseph's life, see what the overall realization he was able to make, and then we're going to hear from people inside this community that have lived this out and are open to sharing their story as we've talked about. So here are a few of the things we've said or asked. The first one we said was, can we trust God's presence in our pain? Because what happens just in a common sense kind of way is that when life is going great, it's not hard to assume God's here, right? When life isn't going so great and things are painful, it's not hard to assume that he's absent. And so we just said, let's learn to trust God's presence, even and maybe even we should say especially in the midst of our pain. We then said, along the same vein, can we trust his steadfast love when our circumstances can't necessarily prove it? There are times in my life where it's easy to see God's love. Kids are healthy, marriage is strong, enough money in the bank, church is growing, pretty easy. There are other times where my circumstances, if you just had my circumstances or your circumstances to look at, you wouldn't go, well, of course God is love. But can we trust his love even in the midst of our circumstances not declaring or proving it, at least we could say it that way. And then we talked about how Joseph had been forgotten by the cupbearer. And we said, you know what? Sometimes in our lives, what's worse than being hated is someone that we care a lot about, or a company or a church that we care a lot about, actually pretending like we don't exist. So we asked the question, have you ever felt like God has actually forgotten you? Have you ever felt like God himself has actually forgotten you? And then we talked about, eventually what happens with most crashes is that we come out on the other side of most crashes. Not always, I'll give you that. But most of the times, the financial situation will get better. The relationship, whether it's that one or a new one, will get better. Health usually gets better. Not always. I'm with you on that. And so we needed to walk through a process of what happens when we come out on the other side of a life-crashing situation. And here's some of the things that we asked or said. We said, when your life is no longer crashing, is your faith in God still present? And the reason we ask this question, because many of us may walk away from our faith during those crashing seasons of life, but others of us in this room, our faith is strongest in the crash. You know why? Because we have a lot of high achievers in this room, don't we? And you know what? Let's think about it like this. For some of us, when we get into a financial crash, if it's a little one, if we need to find $200 for a bill, I don't need great faith for that. Most of you in the room don't need great faith for that. If you have a bill, some of you do. If you have a bill for $200,000, I assume most of you, that's an issue, right? Come on, shake your head. I need to know I'm not just in the 1% up here. $200,000, that's an issue. okay? But our faith can be strong in those moments. But then we said when we come out of a crash, what we're tempted to do is set our faith down or transfer our faith to the person or the group or the company or whatever who seems responsible, rather than keeping our faith in God, not just in our desperate moments. Man, if God can take care of us in our desperation situations, then he certainly can be with us when the sun is shining, right? Some people kind of have this martyr complex that because I have faith in God, everything's got to be terrible. It's not always the case, thankfully. Let's keep our faith in God. And we moved on from there, and we talked about how when God brings us out of a crash, he gives us a story. And if we're going to complete the cycle, we need to be people who are willing to share our story, as my friends are going to do in a few moments this morning. We said this comes straight from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, just using the language that we've used in this series, which is this: we receive God's comfort during our life-crashing moments so that we may be able to comfort others in their life-crashing moments. That we can't keep our pain, even though it's tough, we can't keep our pain to ourselves. We need to distribute it, and we need to realize God's given us a story, because what's going to happen throughout your life with your coworkers, with your family and your neighbors, someone's going to come to you. They're going to open up to you and say, I'm going through this right now, and you're going to have a big decision to make. Because what's going to hit your mind is, I've been through something similar. Should I share it? Yes, you should. Yes, you should. And then we got into last week talking about the power of forgiveness. When our life crashes, we need to look back and we need to actually forgive the person or whoever we think is responsible for life crashing, even if it's us. And so we said a couple of things. We said if we are seeking to orient our entire lives around Jesus, and that's the vision here for Epic, if you've forgotten or we've not introduced it to you since you've been here, our vision here is to see a number of people orient our entire lives around Jesus. We don't have this perfectly. Probably that will always be true. We'll never have it perfectly. But we've said this: if we're seeking to orient our entire lives around Jesus, this will eventually have to include forgiving people who have caused our lives to crash. Very difficult. And with that in mind, we finished off last week by saying this: there are few things as difficult and as powerful as true forgiveness. I don't know if I know many things that are harder to do than forgive people. It's one thing if you steal my candy bar. Oh, okay, no, that is the thing, if you steal my candy bar. But it's another thing when you stab me in the back when you're supposed to be a friend. It's another thing when you make commitments to me you don't keep. On and on and on and on we go. I don't know anything is hard, but I also don't know anything that's as powerful in a positive way in healing our hearts. I had someone stop me after service last week and said, what do I do that I want to forgive these people, but they don't even know that they've done anything wrong? That's a tough one. But what the Bible does speak to is, as far as it depends on us and our hearts, make that right. It's tough though, right? When you're like, oh, I mean, I've got to forgive someone that doesn't even think they did me wrong. It's a tough situation. And so what I want to do today is wrap up the story of Joseph and looking at how life crashed for him. And I want you to see, as he looks back over all of the sum total of the crashes in his life, he's going to make a couple of declarations, and one real prominent one. And I want you to see that this morning. So if you have a Bible, turn to Genesis chapter 50. If you need one, raise your hands. We've got all-star cast of volunteers ready to place one into your hands. Genesis chapter 50, this is the reason why I say this is the end of Joseph's life, because the very next heading that you'll see starting in verse 22 of Genesis 50 is the death of Joseph. So you ought to catch that and know that this is as much as we're given from the author of Genesis about Joseph. As you receive those Bibles, we're on page 29 for the rest of us. We are Genesis chapter 50. We'll look at these 7 verses 15 through 21. And here's what I want you to think before we stand to read this together. I want you to think about this. Can it be said, for me, for you, for us, for all of God's people, universally throughout all the ages, can it be said that no matter how bad things get, that ultimately God can bring about good? Each thing, everything, can it be said that God can ultimately bring about good? Would you all stand with me as we look at Joseph's declaration? He just looks back and he realizes something profound, something that can set him free and something that could set us free. No matter how bad life did crash for you, is crashing for you, or will crash for you. And if you're here for the first time, we've just been saying, you know what? It's not a matter if life is going to crash. It's going to. It's a matter of when. Okay? It's not an if for any of us. It's just a matter of when. So here we go. Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. I just closed my Bible. That's awesome. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And then you can see that Joseph remains in Egypt for the next several years. You may be seated. We talked about the issue of forgiveness last week, but you can tell that for Joseph's brothers, they still think that something's coming from Joseph in the way of revenge. And here's why they think it. While they know that Joseph may not have a heart for his brothers, they know that he has a heart for who? His father, Jacob, right? And so what they say is, now that Jacob's dead, Joseph isn't going to worry about what Jacob would think if he were to kill us or get revenge against us. They know that. You can also see this show up when they say, "Hey, Joseph, don't take our word for it, but here's what our dad told us to tell you." Now, who knows if he really told him that or not? I mean, his brothers are not good people. So he could be, you're like, "Oh, Ben, I've never heard this." I'm just saying it's possible that you ever said something that someone else said to help your situation out that someone never said? So they're like, "Oh, Joseph, by the way, Dad said," right? The guy that you trust the most, the guy that you honor the most, the guy that you love the most, the guy that you would do anything for, he said, "Let us off the hook." Joseph begins to weep because that had been Joseph's intention all along. Joseph's heart was stirred towards his brothers, so much so he didn't just forgive them. This is a whole different lesson. This is not the point of today. He didn't just forgive them, but he used everything he had been given to bless them. And can we just be honest? That takes forgiveness to a whole nother step. It's one thing for me to forgive you, and I'm not saying you need to bless everyone that you forgive, depending on what kind of thing happened and how it, all the evil that was a part of it. But for Joseph, he not only keeps them alive, but he blesses them, and he gives them this amazing confidence at the end. "Don't worry, I'm going to provide for you, and I'm going to do the same for your young ones." And you're like, "Well, why did they need Joseph?" Well, they needed Joseph because there was famine in the entire land. If Joseph, he could have killed them however he wanted to. He could have killed them and their little ones through starvation, but he doesn't do this. And what you see, that we've seen from the very beginning of the story, Joseph's brothers' intentions toward Joseph are very evil, right? He's jealous of them in the beginning. They're jealous of him. They hate him. They want to kill him. They don't do that, so pat themselves on the back. They don't kill him. They sell him, though, and he's taken off to Egypt. And they go back, as we've said, and they make the dad believe that Joseph has been devoured, that he's been killed by some wild animals. Their intentions toward Joseph are very evil. But what about God's intentions towards Joseph through this? I mean, could we not say that because God allowed the evil to happen, that God's responsible, or that his intentions toward Joseph are evil? This is the age-old question, right? And no, I'm not going to answer, but the question goes something like this. How does a good, loving God allow evil and suffering? How does a good and loving God allow evil and suffering in our lives? And what you end up having in theological realms are people that get on one side of the fence or the other, and people are like, "Well, whatever happens, God calls it," right? Humans aren't responsible. And other people say, "No, humans alone are responsible. Don't hold God responsible for this." Here's what I know. There are things that happen in our lives, and how that all fits together isn't the point. But the point is this: do God's intentions towards us, if he allows certain things in our life, does it mean that his intentions towards us are evil? What does Joseph say in verse 20? He says to his brothers, "You meant this for evil, like your intentions toward me were for evil, but God meant it for good." And he's realized at this point in his life, as he looks back, he realizes that God has taken responsibility for bringing good about. So if the question for you is, why does God allow this? The answer from your pastor is, I have no clue. I don't know. I just don't. But if the question is, can God ultimately, circle that word if you're, for the four of you taking notes, can God ultimately bring about good? I think we have to lean into the answer being absolutely. Otherwise, I need to walk off this stage and we all need to leave our faith collectively. but we want it to be one or the other. What we want, many of us, we want our faith to only match our experience. And that's the easy way out, right? Good things happen, relationships are strong, bank account's working, it's going to, it's in the right color, right? Then God is great, God is good, right? But we want to be able to deduce that, but if those things aren't happening, then God is evil. But somehow, if we can't get to a place as people who belong to God, who are followers of Jesus Christ, we must get to a place where circumstances don't determine what my God is like. The heart of God determines what God is like. The character of God determines what God is like. The fact that he's taken responsibility in a good way ultimately for my life, that must in my heart and even in my experiences, because if you only evaluate your experience through the experience yourself, guess what? God's got a lot of off days. There's a lot of times where he's not on the job. There's a lot of times where he's Jekyll and Hyde. If my experience and my circumstance, if those two are the only kinds of things that let me know what God is like. But Joseph's able to look back and he says, all of the crashes that you brought into my life, God has used those things for good. He meant it for good. God superseded your purpose. In fact, because my life crashed, God used my life to do things I never could have done without the crash. And God might use your life in the same way. And I don't know all the answers to the question, why does God allow it? But I think part of the answer sometimes is so that when God brings us out of the crash, whether this side of eternity or the other side, how much more grateful are we for it? How do we appreciate things if we never had them taken from us? Right? How can you best love your wife if she was perfect? And mine is, but how can you do that if they never hurt you? How can we love God if everything is just rosy all the time? We can love him, but we couldn't appreciate all that means. The reason why the whole thing our faith is based on is called the gospel, the good news. A lot of people try to say, here's the good news, without ever realizing what the bad news is first. Jesus won't taste sweet to you until you realize how terrible things are without him. Who needs good news unless the other situation's really devastating? And so Joseph just looked back, but here's what we know. Here's what we know. While Joseph is able to look back and see how good came about, you and I won't always be able to. Some of us would say, Ben, if I was Joseph, I could look back and I would be able to maintain my faith in God if I saw all that he saw. You won't always be able to. You won't always be able to see the good. You won't always know. And listen, for people who take the real super spiritual kind of mottos in life, which just, kill me. Like somebody dies and someone goes up to him and says, or their friend dies and you go up to someone and say, that's all right, I'm sure God just needed another angel. I'm sure God's got plenty of angels. All right? But everybody's got this, oh, it's okay, God's good. Listen, I want to get to that point, but I want to wrestle through it, because if you just can state that without any emotion and any contemplation on it, I just think you're phony. I just think you are. If you can just go, 24/7, I believe God's going to work good out of this terrible situation. We want to battle through it. Sometimes, guys, it's just hanging on to our faith. It's not always going, there's a huge platform of faith all around me and I've got all this big faith to stand on. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's just holding on. Or sometimes it's realizing that we don't have to hold on, but he's holding on to us. But he brings about good. Here's what Paul said as he's looking forward to all that God's going to do ultimately in eternity. He says in Romans 8:28, some of you know this, but we need to lean into the reality of it. Paul said, we know that for those who love God, all things, say that with me, all things, say it again convincingly. All things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. All things, you won't always be able to, like Joseph, to see how all things work together for good, but we've got to trust him. And some of us are like, but Ben, I need to see it before I can trust. And what I've got to say to you is you'll never have faith. I'm not asking for blind faith. I think God's got a decent reputation. Okay, I think his resume is up to par. But you will have to exhibit faith long before you see it, right? Because anyone, what did Jesus say? I think, I haven't thought about this till just this moment, but didn't he say things like, blessed are you because you've believed, but more blessed are those who will believe without seeing? It's easy on the back end to go, oh, of course God did that. But can you, in the midst of it, when it's taken away, when the ending doesn't seem like it's going to go the way that you want it, when you don't have enough money in the account, when the relationships are severely fragmented, can you in that moment go, God, this is terrible. Please do something about it, but I'm trusting you. That's what he wants us to get to. That's what he wants us to get to. And what we've been saying through this whole Joseph series is that what Joseph does is paint a really clear picture ultimately of who Jesus is and what Jesus is like. And I think as we end with this idea of evil intentions from one group, good intentions from God, and overcoming the evil intentions, and even using the evil in our lives to bring about ultimate good. Right? For Joseph, what does he do? He uses the crashes in Joseph's life so that eventually Joseph is the one dispensing the grain during the famine. So he's able to keep not just his brothers alive, but tons and tons of people, as it says in verse 21. God kept me alive for this reason. With Jesus, what you see are people that are supposed to be really good spiritual leaders crucifying him. Evil intentions. And in Acts chapter 3, what Peter does, Peter and John, they've just told this man to be healed in the powerful name of Jesus, and this guy who was lame from birth, all of a sudden is up walking and leaping, the text says. And then again, the religious elite of the day and in that society, they come in and they're like, you got to quit doing this. It's bad for lame people to get walking and jumping and leaping. And so Peter launches into a pretty great sermon. I want to give you 3 verses from that sermon to show, just like Joseph, how evil intentions from a group of people can be used so that God's good intentions ultimately prevail over them. Here's what Peter says to him in Acts 3:13 through 15. He says to them, the people of Israel, and especially those leaders who you'll see engaged later on, but the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and the God of our fathers glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered over, personal responsibility, evil intention, and you denied in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. So if you don't know that story, Pilate decides he's going to release Jesus. He finds nothing evil in Jesus, and they're like, no, you can't do that. Verse 14. But you, he's talking to all of those who were responsible, evil intentions, but you denied the holy and righteous one, and you asked for a murderer to be granted to you. That's Barabbas. And some of you at least know the Easter story. Barabbas is the murderer. He gets off the hook. Jesus is the innocent one. He is treated like a criminal as though he were the murderer, though. And here's what Peter says. And you, with evil intentions, you killed the author of life. I love that title, by the way. You killed the author of life, which is impossible. That's what Peter's kind of saying, okay? You killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. What Peter's saying there, what the beautiful story of our whole faith is this. Everything Joseph experienced in some major way to Joseph, but minor way compared to this, Jesus does in a major way. God uses the evil intentions of an entire community of religious leaders to crucify Jesus. But he uses the evil of those men. His good overcomes it, and that's the only way you and I can sit in a relationship with God where he doesn't want to kill us. Isn't that cool? How? Because God knows how to overcome. And so what Joseph said, the reason that I'm still alive today is because God used my crash to put me in a position to be able to feed you and keep you alive. And what Jesus is saying, the reason God allowed the evil to happen to me on the cross is so that you might get the best good ever in history. It's good news. And for those of you in this room, and I know there's a bunch of you, and I'm so glad that you come to Epic and you show up at your small group. If you've never placed your faith in Jesus, this is what this is about. Not just taking your evil and making it good, but a faith, the Christian faith, rests on the reality of Jesus taking your sin upon his shoulders, bearing the weight of your sin on the cross. He didn't deserve it. You and I did. And because of what he went through, though evil intentions started the process seemingly on the surface, God uses his good intentions to rescue you and I for all eternity, thereby giving us peace between us and the God who made us that we've sinned against. If you never responded to that, first thing I want to say to you this morning is, our staff would love to talk to you about that. Or maybe some of you have reached a place where you're ready to place your faith in Jesus. I know someone had mentioned to one of our leaders after the last service, I like the Old Testament and I like the teaching of Jesus, but I just haven't got to the place of making him my Savior. That's what he's come to do. And John says in John 1:12, yet to all who received him, he gave the right to become children of God. And you remember what Romans 8:28 said. It didn't say that God works good for everyone who's ever existed. What did it say? God works for the good of those who love him And I think what you see throughout the Bible is that those who have brought themselves under his lordship, which just means have brought ourselves under the reality of his kingship. Because remember, throughout the scriptures, what you see, it's one thing for people who humble themselves under what God's up to in the world and in eternity. It's a very different thing for those who never do. And so I just want to make sure that this is not like, hey, for every person alive on the planet throughout all the ages, even those that curse God, God works good for them. It's that God works good for those who love him, who have come and surrendered themselves to him and said, God, I believe that you're in control. I believe that your heart is good. Even though the circumstances are terrible around me, I'm going to press on and I'm going to believe that you have good intentions for my life. So at this time, I'd love to introduce you to Dan and Betsy Wright. Give it up for them as they come join me on the stage. Dan and Betsy are a great couple in our church, and they are willing, just as we've told many of you, to be willing to share your story. They are willing to do this in a very corporate way this morning, and so I hope that you'll be encouraged. I hope, while some of you will relate to the actual thing that they've been through, no matter what the situation is, I hope that you will take what they say to heart as they really lay open their hearts and let us know what they've learned throughout their process. So you guys have been married how long?
We've been married for just over 7 years.
You do know the anniversary?
I do.
Which is?
June 24th.
All right, awesome. We won't ask you what year. That's enough. And how long have you guys lived here in San Francisco?
We've lived here for 3 years after 3 years in Boston.
Okay. Betsy, why don't you tell us about that moment or that season of life where you realize, you know what, I want to be a mom?
Yeah, I don't know the exact moment, but I've just always known that I wanted to be a mom. And I had a great job after college that I worked at until last year, but really I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom.
Awesome. And you did not want to be a stay-at-home mom, right?
No, and even if I did, that was not happening. Because Betsy let me know before we ever got married that she was going to be a stay-at-home mom, and she wanted
Someone
kids
has to make the
more
money.
than anything. So.
Awesome. Can you guys share with us some of the initial challenges when you're like, okay, you know what, we've had an extended honeymoon, just the two of us. It's time to start adding to the family, or at least doing what we can, right, to add to the family. What were some of the initial challenges just trying to get pregnant and kind of initially?
Right before we got married, we were told that it would probably be difficult for us to get pregnant, and that when we were ready, we should just go straight to a fertility specialist. So after we moved to San Francisco and Dan had settled into his job here, we found a doctor, and we met with her for the first time in January of 2011. And for the next year, we ran tests and tried a couple of different fertility medications, and nothing was working. And so in December of that year, we had our first embryo transfer for IVF, in vitro fertilization. And we found out right after Christmas that it was successful and that we were pregnant. And
Yay.
Man, this part gets me every time. And we were so excited. But how the process works is you have the initial blood test to find out if you're pregnant, and then you have to wait a few weeks before you can go in to have an ultrasound, and at that point, you know, hopefully you see a heartbeat and see that the baby's developing well and everything. So we went to that appointment, and the doctor pulls up the screen, and she explains that there's nothing there and that I have miscarried. And, you know, she goes on to say that it's fairly common in all, in all pregnancies that there's a good chance of miscarriage, and that we're young and there's still a lot we can try, and there's no indication, that this won't work out for us. And we are devastated. But we're also anxious to try again. And so we try again, and we get almost the exact same result. And we try again, and we get almost the exact same result. And at that point, it was summertime, and so we were going to be out of town too much to do another round. And so we took a break, and I had another test scheduled for late that October or August. And for this particular test, you have to take a pregnancy test in the morning because they don't want to, do any harm to any existing pregnancy that you might have. And so we were shocked when it was positive, and I had to go into the doctor and have the blood test, and she called and told us, that unfortunately the levels were too low to be sustaining a healthy pregnancy, and I was in the middle of miscarrying again.
And you're doing what? I mean, you're just trying to like, hey, it's, you know.
Yeah, I'd love to say that I was the faithful guy here, and I was saying all the right things, but the name of the series is When Life Crashes, and life has crashed plenty of times for us, even throughout the 7 years that we've been married, but this was the crash. Not only was it a situation where we tried again and again to get pregnant and both wanted it more than anything. For me personally, it was a situation where, I love Betsy more than anything, and wanting to try to make this happen, and just failing again and again and again. And on top of that, I was in a job at the time where I was working about 100 hours a week, more than that, pretty much every week. So I was feeling bad about not being able to do anything, and then I wasn't even there to sort of comfort her. And then on top of it, we were really worried about how are we going to pay for this. We didn't know if our insurance was going to cover it or what. So we really struggled. And, whenever I've been in that situation in the past where it's, life is crashing and you can either sort of look away from God and say, I don't want any part of the God thing anymore, or you can say, basically, God, I'm all in. And I'd love to say that we went this way and we always go this way kind of the whole time, but that wasn't the case. We kind of went through the whole range, starting with just feeling very angry and being upset about the whole thing. But then eventually we got to a place with a lot of help from everybody in the church here where we were able to just sort of give it up to God and say, whatever your will is, let your will be done. And if that's that we're going to have kids, great. If that means that we're going to adopt, great. If that means that we don't have kids ever, as terrible as that sound, if that was his will, we were in for that. And so we really focused on trying to just have that be our prayer, and praying. A lot of people in the church here prayed with us, our extended family, our friends, and we also did some fasting. A lot of people again in the church gave up something that was important to them and reminded them to pray about this. We gave up all potato products, including French fries, which for us was a huge deal. Love the In-N-Out Burger French fries. That was rough.
Man. I'm hungry right now. And so I know that, adoption is obviously a great avenue. There's a number of us in our church right now, including myself, who are in that process. And so that would have been great. It wouldn't have been like, this is second rate or, whatever. But for you guys, it really, I know you were talking to an adoption attorney, and you'll talk about that in just a moment. But it kind of came this moment like, hey, we have one last go at this. And talk to us about that, just how you were persuaded by your doctor, and then kind of how you guys made that decision.
Yeah, at this point, we were just so emotionally exhausted from this cycle that we were in of being excited when we got pregnant and then being so devastated when we miscarried. And so we decided that we would try one more time. We had these last 2 embryos, and we were going to transfer them, and we were going to pray for a miracle. And we had an appointment with our doctor to go over the latest test results. And we really thought, she would say, oh, there's still a ton we can try. You guys are young, keep saying the same things she'd been saying. And instead, she says, these test results are not what I would have expected for what I thought was going wrong. And there's nothing else that I can do for you. And so at that point, we said, well, what about trying one last time with these 2 embryos that we have left? And she said, okay, but I want to go through the whole scenario first. You're going to get pregnant, you always do, and you're going to miscarry because you always do. And what are you going to do then? And so she had us talk to an adoption attorney just to go over all of our options there and make sure that we really did want to do the last transfer. And we decided we were going to go ahead and try one last time.
And you tried one last time, and you find out you're pregnant, like you always have. Tell us about that moment and kind of where the confidence was, and how do you even handle that news?
Yeah, so it was around Christmas of the next year. We'd been trying for basically about 2 years at this point, and Betsy gets a positive test result, and she, of course, is very excited about this, and I'm sort of trying to temper that excitement because I'm like, well, this has happened a lot of times now, and we kind of know where this is headed. So, we were excited, but we were trying to sort of temper our excitement. And then the doctor said that the next step was for us to go back into her office sort of right after the holidays. We were scheduled to go up to Betsy's folks' place in northern Washington. for the holidays, and we said we can't wait that long. Can we get in there early? And so she arranged for us to come in for an ultrasound before the holidays, and we'll never forget that day. We went into her office, sort of the same office where we'd gone a lot of times at this point, and each time before it had been the same situation where we go in, positive pregnancy result, we do the ultrasound, and there's nothing there. And this time we go in, and we'll never forget these words. She says, "Do you see what I see?" And we're like, "Well, we can't really read ultrasounds, but tell us what you see." And she's like, "Well, I see baby A, and I see baby B." And, we were over the moon at that point. But that still wasn't sort of the end, because there was no heartbeat at that point because it was still too early. And so she said, "Come back after the holidays and maybe we can see if there's a heartbeat or not."
So you guys came back, and
so we came back. We went back into the doctor's office again, cautiously optimistic, but really tempered by what had happened so far. And we went in. She did the ultrasound, and there were 2 heartbeats. And she turned the volume all the way up, and it was like 2 drums just going back and forth, and we just lost it at that point. That was pretty much the best moment of our lives so far. So, and I'm going to try to keep it together here. This is I always say the only things I cry about are this and the Giants winning the World Series, but I can't help myself.
I hear you, man. You're a good man. You're a good man. Well, let's fast forward a bit. What's it like the day that the twins, I know there's a lot of things between, like, for me, even up here, I'm like, oh, are they going to send me an email? And like, hey, 1 week is good. And then we check in with you guys a couple weeks later. But the day finally comes, the twins were born. Why don't you tell us about that? I know that you guys each had a different perspective, figuratively and literally probably for that.
Yeah.
But give it to us.
Yeah, so that was an interesting day. So it started off with kind of first thing when we woke up, I was like getting ready to go to the gym, and Betsy goes, "Oh, I think my water broke." And I said, "Are you sure?" And the reason I said that was we'd had a couple of false alarms at that point, one of which involved us and some of our best friends from New York who were out for the weekend, spending the entire weekend in the hospital, and then she wasn't in labor. So she said, "Yeah, I'm sure," and like, let's go. And so we get in the car, we go to the hospital, and turns out she really is in labor. And they kind of encourage us to just settle in, because they said with twins, this is going to take a while, and she's still a ways off. And then it seems like we just sort of settled in, and they're immediately like, "Okay, she's ready." And so we go into the delivery room, and again, they said, you should sort of settle in, but pretty quickly thereafter, they're like, "Okay, she's coming." And basically at that point, our daughter, Lila, came out, and I just remember the feeling looking at her and seeing that moment when she goes from sort of not seeming alive to just being filled with color and crying and just being full of life. It was unlike anything we've ever seen or experienced before. And then I'm cutting the umbilical cord for Lila, and the doctor says, you've got a few hours before the second one comes. And so I'm just like staring at her. And then as soon as I do that, they say, "Oh, here comes Jay." And so I'm rushing back over there, like literally running, trying to help Betsy breathe and everything. And then same thing happens. Jay comes and is just filled with color and is crying, and it's like, we have twins. There they are.
So many things, and I know it's quite a lengthy story, and it's to be able to tell the total theme. But we wanted to give adequate time. But to wrap up, from maybe both of you, what has this done for your faith? Because one of the things that you guys know, we try not to pretend around here, which means this in this situation. We're not going to tell you, hey, if you just have enough faith, every one of you who wants to get pregnant will one day. We're not going to tell you, because here's what's going to happen. Some people are going to have this story, other people won't. Some of you will be healed of your diseases, others of you won't. Some of you might marry one day, others of you might not. So we're never going to stand up here and just say, hey, you just believe enough, although we certainly want to be people of faith. And so I know you guys had the crash. Now people can say, well, of course, they can look back. But I know you kept your faith mostly intact through that process. How has it grown your faith, Betsy and Dan, just the whole thing?
It's been a huge reminder to us that, God has a perfect plan for us. And, it was such a hard time for us trying to get pregnant and going through all the miscarriages. But now being able to look back on the experience as a whole and knowing the outcome, it's easy for us to see God's hand at work throughout the whole situation. And now that we have Jay and Lila, I think, oh man, I almost missed out on this amazing experience of being able to be pregnant with them and give birth to them. But I also feel confident that if things had ended differently and we'd ended up adopting, I would still be sitting here saying, oh man, I almost missed out on this amazing experience to adopt a child. And, we would know that that was God's perfect plan for expanding our family.
Yeah, I think it really has kind of driven home for both of us in a whole new way, sort of God's power and his faithfulness and his mercy. It was a situation where, we tried for a long time and time again, to kind of will this into being. We tried everything. We tried science. That wasn't working. And it was just made so clear to us. I mean, the doctor told us we're wasting our times. Like, what are you guys gluttons for punishment? What are you doing? And, God made that happen. And not only did God work, that miracle, really, we say it's two miracles. He did a lot of other things for us. I was in that job I mentioned where I was, 100 hours a week and had no time. And, I wasn't even looking for a new job, although I probably should have been. But he, one of my companies just sort of called me out of the blue and said, hey, how'd you like to come work for us? I'm a lawyer, and so that was amazing. And now I have time, on the weekends and at night to actually spend and be part of their lives, which is incredible. And our insurance ended up paying for the whole thing, which is again incredible. So I think sort of another miracle for us is that it's really taken our faith to a whole new level, where now each time as life crashes again, when it inevitably will, we can look back at that and say, God is good, and God does, see things through and look after those who love Him. And, that would be just my prayer for everybody else in this room, is that, when you get to that point and life crashes and you've done everything and you feel totally hopeless, that you would just remember this story, remember other stories, and just know that God does love you and will, see it through.
You're not trying to take my job, are you? Such a great story of God's faithfulness, of staying with God through the process. You see this with Joseph. It crashes again and again and again. And so thanks for being willing to share your story. Would you guys give it up for Dan and Betsy as we get ready to close out. And while this is a powerful story, it's not the only story in our community. Keep sharing your story. And one of the things that a community is for, don't forget this, is we got about 50 people coming to our 1.0 who are brand new to Epic after this for lunch. And one of the things we just want them to know is that here's the kind of community that we are. We want to believe that God has good intentions, but we also want to hold hands with one another and help each other believe, borrow each other's faith, so to speak, and to believe that we're going to see God bring about good ultimately. Would you pray with me as I want to move into just a short response time. Brad and Susan are coming up to lead us in a song that I think closes the series out well. The idea that, you see in the scriptures that God, what He does is He brings beauty out of ashes. He's done that for Dan and Betsy. He's done that for Joseph. He has or can and will do that for you. And so I just want to pray for us, and then let's just believe and help each other believe that no matter how this looks, things aren't as they always seem. No matter how it feels, this isn't the end of our story. And whether it's this side of eternity or when we see Jesus face to face, as we've been promised, He's told us there's no more pain, there's no more sorrow. So no matter when He does it, let's believe and look forward to the reality that He will. Would you all stand with me as I pray? Father, I thank You so much for the story from Joseph. God, I thank You that You use evil intentions from his brothers to bring about incredible good for a whole lot of people. And then, God, You do it ultimately on the cross. You use the evil intentions of people who didn't want their religious system threatened. So they killed Jesus, Your perfect Son. Your perfect Son, God, with evil intent. And yet You use that because Your intentions are good. God, You use that for the greatest eternal good possible. God, let us hold on to that reality. God, let us learn from Joseph, from Dan and Betsy, from our own stories that, God, it's not always what we would want, but you are always more than what we want. God, you are what we need. God, you are who we look to. And God, may you become what we want most of all as a church community. Yes, blessing. Yes, favor. Yes, good fortune. But God, more than all of that, we want you, and we want to believe that at the end of the day, you give us a foundation to stand on. And God, you are ultimately responsible for bringing good to those of us who belong to you. God, I pray more would attach themselves to you. In Jesus' name, amen.